All right, let's dive into one of the most mysterious and unsettling concepts in the Warhammer 40K universe. The idea that some beings might be able to navigate the warp without the Astronomican. It's a topic that sparks both awe and dread among those who dare to consider it. For the Imperium of Man, the Astronomican is a lifeline, a blazing beacon of the Emperor's psychic might that guides ships safely through the howling chaos of the warp. Without it, human vessels would be lost to the tides of madness, their crews driven to despair or worse, twisted into monstrous forms by the very energies they sought to traverse. Yet, whispers persist of strange, outcast psychers, mutants, even, who can cut through the warp like a blade through mist, moving without the need for the Emperor's light. It's a chilling idea, one that hints at a forgotten, perhaps forbidden, potential within the human gene pool. These figures are sometimes spoken of in hushed tones by rogue traders, whispered about in the darkened corners of starship mess halls, or hinted at in the half-burned fragments of ancient cogitator logs. Imagine it, a human stripped of the Imperium's guidance, alone in the heart of the Immaterium, yet still capable of steering their way through its ever-shifting tides. It defies everything the Imperium holds sacred about human survival and dominance in the galaxy. These individuals, if they exist, represent a stark contradiction to the ordered, hierarchical faith of the Imperium, where the Emperor's light is the only hope against the eternal night. But what would it take for someone to develop such a power? Could it be a mutation, a rare psychic gift, or perhaps the result of exposure to the twisted realms of the warp itself? And if such beings truly walk among us, what might they reveal about the forgotten corners of humanity's potential, or its deepest, darkest fears? All right, if we're going to talk about these mysterious navigators, we first need to get a sense of the kind of power they might wield. Psychers, mutants, and other psychic beings in the Warhammer 40K universe are a chaotic and unpredictable lot, born with the ability to sense and manipulate the very fabric of reality. They're not just tapping into a different plane of existence. They're reaching into a place where thoughts and emotions become raw, living forces, a place where the boundaries between mind and matter dissolve. Mutants with psychic abilities are, by their very nature, outcasts. The Imperium fears them, not just for their unpredictable powers, but because their mere existence challenges the rigid order of humanity's empire. Some are born with this gift, a quirk of genetics that makes them hypersensitive to the shifting tides of the Immaterium. Others develop their abilities through harsh exposure to the warp, their minds twisted and shaped by the raw energies that pulse through that nightmare realm. Either way, these beings have a connection to the warp that goes beyond mere survival. They can feel it, reach into it, and perhaps even bend it to their will. But what exactly does that mean? For starters, it's not just about throwing lightning bolts or twisting the minds of their enemies. It's a deeper, more primal sense, like a blind person learning to navigate a crowded street by the vibrations of passing footsteps or the subtle shifts in air pressure. These psychic mutants might not need the Astronomican because they've developed their own, more personal form of orientation. They might sense the currents of thought and fear that ripple through the warp, using those echoes as a kind of psychic sonar. Imagine the sheer terror of it, reaching out with your mind into the maelstrom, feeling the whispers of long-dead souls, the hungering thoughts of demons, and the distant echoes of dying stars. It's not a power that can be taught or trained, at least not in the way the Adeptus Astra Telepathica might shape a novice psyker. It's a raw, unfiltered instinct, a survival trait as much as it is a weapon. And like any mutation, it comes with a cost: madness, corruption, the slow erasure of one's humanity as the warp seeps into their very soul. Yet despite the risks, some of these mutants might thrive in this chaos. They could become living compasses, guiding their fellow outcasts through the darkest reaches of the galaxy. They might even develop unique methods of interpreting the warp, like a sort of psychic echolocation, sensing the ripples left by other ships, or the faint, desperate prayers of the living as they drift through the abyss. It's a terrifying concept. The idea that these beings might have found a way to harness the warp's madness without succumbing to it, turning what should be a fatal weakness into their greatest strength. It challenges everything the Imperium holds dear about humanity's place in the galaxy and the Emperor's role as its sole protector. And perhaps that's why these mutants are so deeply feared, hunted down and erased from the annals of Imperial history whenever they're discovered. If we dig a bit deeper into the old records and whispered tales that echo through the dark corners of the Imperium, we start to find hints of these blind navigators scattered throughout human history. They're not a recent phenomenon, nor just a myth born from the fevered dreams of rogue traders or the half-mad ravings of chaos cultists. In fact, some of the oldest dust-covered data vaults contain fragments that suggest humanity's first steps into the stars may have been guided by such beings, individuals whose grasp of the warp predated the Astronomican by millennia. Consider the ancient pre-imperial days when humanity's reach extended across the stars, but without the guidance of the Emperor's golden light. It's a period shrouded in mystery, a time when human civilization stretched across the galaxy, yet lacked the rigid order and control that the Imperium enforces today. Some of the most obscure techno-arcana from this era, the kind of secrets locked away in Mechanicus vaults or whispered about by the few remaining men of iron, hint at human navigators who relied on nothing more than their own psychic instincts to chart a path through the warp. It's a chilling thought that perhaps humanity's first warp travelers were mutants, beings born with an instinctual grasp of the immaterium, whose senses stretched beyond the physical and into the ever-shifting tides of that maddening realm. These early pathfinders might have been feared and revered in equal measure, their minds both a blessing and a curse to their tribes and fleets. Imagine the kind of power it would take to steer a ship through the roiling chaos of the warp without a beacon, not just strength of will, but a mind so deeply attuned to the fabric of reality that it could sense the slightest ripple in the ether. Some fringe scholars and renegade scribes even suggest that these blind navigators may have been the precursors to the navigator gene that the Emperor would later cultivate and harness for his great crusade. Perhaps these ancient mutants were the missing link, the raw, untamed forebears of the noble navigator houses, their abilities rough and unrefined, but no less potent. Others argue that they might have been something else entirely, a separate branch of humanity's psychic evolution that was later stamped out or bred into obscurity by the gene-shaping programs of the Dark Age of technology. Of course, this theory is controversial, even within the hidden circles of radical inquisitors and fringe Mechanicus cults. To suggest that the Navigator houses, the backbone of Imperial warp travel, might have been born from mutants is tantamount to heresy in many quarters. But if these ancient navigators did exist, their abilities might explain some of the stranger tales from the age of strife-isolated human worlds that somehow maintained contact through the warp despite the chaos and psychic storms that tore the galaxy apart. There are even darker whispers, the kind that rarely make it into the official histories. Stories of human fleets that vanished into the warp, only to re-emerge centuries later, their crews twisted and changed, guided by beings who claim to see without eyes and sense without light. Some say these ships returned with ancient forbidden knowledge, their holds filled with the corrupted relics of dead civilizations, and their psychers whispering secrets that drove entire sectors to madness. It's a haunting possibility that the galaxy might be littered with the remnants of these blind navigators, their bones scattered among the forgotten starships and derelict stations that drift through the cold void, forever lost to history. And if a few of them still exist, lurking on the fringes of human space or hiding in the shadow depths of forgotten hives, what strange destinies might they still hold? All right, trying to grasp how these blind navigators might actually guide a ship through the warp without the Astronomican is like trying to understand the mind of a creature born in darkness. It's a fundamentally different way of perceiving reality, one that defies the rigid, ordered thinking of most Imperial scholars. But if we're willing to take a few steps into the unknown, the clues are there, scattered like the echoes of dying stars, faint but undeniable. For starters, it's likely that these mutants aren't just sensing the physical movements of the warp, but the emotional and psychic resonances that ripple through it. The warp, after all, is a realm shaped by thought and emotion as much as by gravity and force. It's a place where the anger of a dying warrior or the despair of a doomed world can leave lasting scars in the fabric of reality, echoes that persist long after their sources have been silenced. For these blind navigators, the warp might feel more like a living thing, a vast, ever-changing ocean where each swell and current carries a story, a memory, or a whispered fear. Imagine what it would be like to step into that abyss without the guiding light of the Emperor's will, relying only on your own senses to find a path through the madness. It's a terrifying thought, but perhaps these mutants have developed something akin to a second sight, an instinctual awareness that allows them to detect the subtle shifts and currents in the immaterium. They might perceive the warp as a series of overlapping vibrations, each one a pulse of raw emotion or psychic discharge that they can follow like a trail of breadcrumbs through a dark forest. This idea isn't as far-fetched as it might seem. After all, human psychers have long demonstrated a range of strange, seemingly supernatural abilities, from precognition to telepathy, and even the power to bend reality itself to their will. It's not a stretch to imagine that some mutants might have taken this a step further, learning to read the emotional signatures of the warp the way a hunter reads the broken branches and faint scents of a forest trail. In this sense, these navigators wouldn't just be moving through the warp, they'd be interpreting it, listening to its whispers, and riding its currents like a sailor navigating the winds of an unseen sea. Of course, this kind of travel wouldn't be without its risks. The warp is a treacherous place at the best of times, a churning maelstrom of raw, uncontrolled power that can tear a ship apart or drive its crew to madness. Without the steady, unchanging beacon of the Astronomican to anchor their thoughts, these blind navigators would need to rely entirely on their own instincts, a kind of sixth sense that most humans can barely imagine. They'd have to tune themselves to the faint, chaotic signals that pulse through the warp, feeling the pull of distant stars, the echoes of ancient battles, and the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of forgotten gods. Some might even argue that this makes them more attuned to the true nature of the warp than the navigators of the Imperium, who rely on a fixed point of reference and the relative safety of their psychic bloodlines. These mutants, on the other hand, would be walking a far more dangerous path, one that demands constant awareness and a willingness to embrace the madness that lurks in the darkness. It's a form of navigation that would require a rare combination of fearlessness, instinct, and raw psychic talent, the kind of traits that might just be enough to keep a ship from being swallowed by the hungry void. And perhaps this is what makes these blind navigators so unsettling to the Imperium. They represent a different way of thinking, a rejection of the rigid hierarchical control that defines humanity's empire. They are free in a way that most psychers can never be, unbound by the chains of tradition and the weight of 1,000 years of imperial doctrine. They are, in a sense, a reminder of what humanity might have become if it had chosen a different path, one less focused on order and control and more willing to embrace the chaos of the galaxy. For those bold or desperate enough to attempt navigation without the Astronomican, the risks are staggering. The warp is a place of infinite possibility, but also of infinite danger, a realm where the laws of physics are more of a suggestion than a rule, and where the very fabric of reality itself can twist and tear without warning. It's a place where time loses all meaning, where minutes can stretch into centuries or collapse into seconds, and where the thoughts and fears of a ship's crew can become all too real. Without the guiding light of the Emperor's beacon, a ship is like a sailor lost in a storm, blind to the currents and whirlpools that could drag it into the abyss. Even the most skilled navigator can find themselves hopelessly adrift, cut off from the physical universe and left to the mercy of the warp's ever-changing tides. In these dark, uncharted regions, entire fleets have disappeared without a trace, their crews lost to madness or worse, their ships swallowed by the hungry void. But the psychological risks are perhaps the greatest danger of all. The warp is not just a physical place, it's a psychic one, a realm where the raw, unfiltered thoughts and emotions of sentient beings are given form and substance. For a navigator who relies on their own senses to guide them through this chaos, the constant pressure of the warp's shifting tides can be overwhelming. It's like standing in the eye of a storm, with the howling winds of 1,000 dead voices tearing at your mind, whispering secrets and half-truths that can drive even the strongest will to madness. Worse still, the warp is infested with predators, beings that hunger for the souls of the living, drawn to the faint psychic light of a mortal mind like sharks to the scent of blood. Without the protection of the Emperor's light, a blind navigator is especially vulnerable to these creatures, their psychic senses acting like a beacon for every demon and warp entity within 1,000 light years. It's a terrifying thought that by merely existing, these mutants might be painting a target on their own backs, calling the attention of creatures that would tear them apart for the slightest hint of weakness. And then there are the warp storms, vast, chaotic tempests that can swallow entire star systems and twist the paths of ships that stray too close. For a blind navigator, these storms are not just a navigational hazard, but a direct threat to their sanity. To step into one is to risk being torn apart by the raw, chaotic energies that pulse through the warp, to feel your mind shredded and scattered across the infinite planes of unreality. Even the most skilled psyker would struggle to survive such a journey, their mind battered by the relentless psychic currents that swirl through the heart of the storm. Yet, despite these risks, some still choose to brave the darkness, driven by a combination of desperation, madness, and sheer, unrelenting willpower. Perhaps it's because, for these blind navigators, the warp is not just a place of fear, but a place of possibility. A place where the rules of the physical universe are suspended, where the impossible becomes possible, and where the brave or the foolish might just find the power to reshape the galaxy itself. Of course, there are whispers that some of these navigators don't travel alone, that they have found ways to shield themselves from the worst of the warp's horrors, to cloak their psychic signatures in the echoes of long-dead worlds or the shadows of forgotten gods. It's a theory that's both intriguing and terrifying, suggesting that these mutants might have developed their own forms of psychic armor, their own ways of hiding from the hungry eyes that stalk the depths of the immaterium. But if that's true, it raises even darker questions. Questions about what they might have had to sacrifice to gain such power, and what it might cost them in the end. For the Imperium, the mere existence of these blind navigators is a deeply unsettling thought. It's not just that they challenge the established order, they outright defy it. The Imperium's entire system of control is built on the idea that humanity must be guided, shaped, and protected from the horrors of the galaxy by a single divine hand. The Emperor's light is the foundation of that system, the beacon that keeps the Imperium's fleets connected and its colonies united. Without it, humanity would be scattered, isolated, and vulnerable to the countless horrors that lurk in the darkness between the stars. These mutants, if they truly exist, threaten to undermine that control. They represent a different path, one that rejects the rigid hierarchy of the Imperium and embraces a more chaotic, unpredictable form of power. It's a path that could lead to anarchy, to the kind of disunity that nearly destroyed humanity during the Age of Strife. For the Adeptus Terra and the High Lords of Terra, that's a risk they simply cannot afford to take. The mere rumor of these blind navigators is enough to send the Inquisition into a frenzy, their agents scouring the galaxy for any hint of psychic heresy. And it's not just a question of ideology. These mutants could pose a very real physical threat to the Imperium's fleets. If even a handful of these navigators were to survive, they could potentially guide entire rebel fleets through the warp without relying on the Astronomican. They could slip through Imperial blockades, strike at undefended worlds, and vanish back into the darkness before the Imperial Navy even knew what hit them. It's a nightmare scenario for any admiral, the idea that their carefully laid plans could be shattered by a single ship with a blind navigator at the helm, moving through the warp with the same ease that an eel slips through the cracks in a reef. There's also the issue of corruption. Psychers are already a dangerous lot, their minds constantly exposed to the whispers of the warp, their souls forever at risk of possession or corruption. These blind navigators, cut off from the Emperor's light, would be even more vulnerable to such influence. They might start out as mere mutants, guided by instinct and desperation, but it wouldn't take much for them to fall under the sway of darker forces. Imagine an entire fleet, its course set by a navigator who whispers to demons, who makes pacts with the entities that dwell in the warp's darkest depths. It's the kind of thing that keeps Inquisitors awake at night, their minds racing with the implications of such a scenario. And then there's the matter of control. The Imperium relies on the Navigator houses to maintain its grip on the stars, their monopoly on warp travel, a crucial piece of the Imperial puzzle. If these blind navigators were to become more than just a legend, it could shatter that monopoly, disrupting the delicate balance of power that keeps the Imperium from tearing itself apart. The Navigator houses themselves would likely see these mutants as a direct threat to their status and influence. Their ancient bloodlines suddenly made obsolete by a new, more dangerous breed of warp traveler. But perhaps the greatest threat these navigators pose is the one they represent to the very soul of humanity. They are a reminder of the chaos that lurks beneath the surface of every human mind, a living testament to the raw, untamed potential that the Imperium has spent 10,000 years trying to suppress. They are a crack in the facade, a reminder that humanity's grip on the stars is more fragile than it appears, and that even the might of the Emperor himself might not be enough to hold back the darkness forever. One of the most terrifying aspects of navigating the warp without the Astronomican is the constant threat of demonic attack. The warp is not just a chaotic, ever-shifting ocean of psychic energy. It's also the home of countless predatory entities, beings born from the darkest fears and wildest hopes of every sentient species that has ever lived. For a blind navigator, these entities represent both a constant threat and, perhaps, a potential source of power. Unlike their more conventional counterparts, these mutants wouldn't have the protective aura of the Emperor's light to shield them from the predations of the warp's denizens. They wouldn't have the finely tuned senses of the Navigator houses, their minds shaped over generations to resist the whispers of demons and the corrupting influence of the Immaterium. Instead, they would be relying on raw instinct, their senses tuned not just to the physical shifts in the warp, but to the psychic undercurrents that ripple through it like the tremors of a distant earthquake. This raises an interesting question. Would these blind navigators be more vulnerable to demonic possession, or might they actually be better equipped to resist it? On one hand, their isolation from the Emperor's light would leave them more exposed to the dark whispers that echo through the warp, their minds more susceptible to the insidious influence of the great powers. But on the other hand, their very nature, their ability to move through the warp without the need for a guiding beacon, might make them more resilient to such attacks. It's possible that these mutants have developed their own psychic defenses, a kind of mental armor that allows them to resist the pull of the warp's hungriest denizens. They might perceive the presence of demons not as a direct threat, but as a kind of psychic turbulence, a disturbance in the fabric of reality that they can sense and avoid like a sailor steering clear of a reef. In this sense, they might be less like psychers and more like sharks, creatures of the deep, perfectly adapted to their environment, their senses tuned to the faintest hint of danger. Of course, this kind of survival comes at a cost. To survive in the warp without the Emperor's protection, these mutants would need to embrace a certain level of darkness themselves. They would have to become predators, not just prey, their minds sharpened by the constant threat of attack, their souls hardened against the whispers of madness and despair that echo through the Immaterium. It's a harsh, brutal existence, one that would leave little room for compassion or mercy. And yet, there are whispers of blind navigators who have not only survived the horrors of the warp, but thrived in its depths. Some stories speak of ships guided by these mutants that have returned from the most haunted regions of the galaxy, their hulls scarred by the touch of demonic claws, their crews silent and hollow-eyed, their navigators whispering of battles fought in the heart of the immaterium itself. It's a chilling thought that these beings might not just be survivors, but warriors in their own right, their minds sharpened to a razor's edge by the constant threat of annihilation. They might even see the warp in a way that no ordinary psyker could, their senses tuned to the subtle shifts and echoes that ripple through its depths, their minds hardened against the seductive whispers of the great powers. But this raises another question. What price have these mutants paid for their survival? Have they become something less than human, their souls twisted and scarred by their constant battles with the warp's denizens? Or have they found a way to balance on the knife's edge between madness and clarity, their minds sharpened by the endless bloody dance of predator and prey that defines life in the immaterium? It's a question that cuts to the heart of what it means to be human in the 41st millennium, to stand alone in the darkness, surrounded by monsters, and somehow find the strength to keep moving forward, to keep fighting, to keep hoping, even when the light has gone out and the shadows close in. All right, when it comes to facing the creatures of the warp, these blind navigators are in a uniquely precarious position. The warp is not just a sea of raw, unfiltered psychic energy. It's a living, hungry realm filled with entities that exist solely to feed on the fear, despair, and rage of mortal souls. For most psychers, even the briefest contact with a demon can be a death sentence, their minds overwhelmed by the sheer, unrelenting pressure of a being born from the darkest corners of the human psyche. But for a blind navigator, the relationship with these entities is a far more complicated dance. On one hand, their very nature as unshielded psychers makes them incredibly vulnerable to the predations of the warp's denizens. Without the protective aura of the Emperor's light, they stand exposed in the immaterium, their minds like beacons of raw, untamed power that can draw the attention of demons from light years away. To survive in such an environment, these mutants would need to develop a kind of psychic armor, a mental toughness that goes far beyond anything taught in the Scholastica Psychana or the training halls of the Grey Knights. Yet, there's a theory whispered in the dark corners of rogue trader ships and the hidden archives of radical inquisitors that these blind navigators might actually have an advantage over their more conventional counterparts. Without the rigid, structured minds of the navigator houses, they might be better equipped to sense the subtle currents of the warp, to feel the presence of a demon before it strikes, and to avoid the kind of psychic traps that would ensnare a more traditionally trained psyker. Some even speculate that these mutants might have developed a kind of sixth sense for the presence of warp entities, an instinctual awareness that allows them to steer clear of danger in the same way a bird senses an approaching storm. This would make them not just survivors, but hunters in their own right, their minds sharpened by the constant threat of attack, their senses tuned to the faintest ripple in the fabric of reality. Of course, this kind of existence comes with a heavy price. To survive in the depths of the warp, these blind navigators would have to walk a fine line between strength and madness, their minds constantly tested by the whispers of demons and the seductive pull of the great powers. It's a path that few could walk without being consumed by the darkness, their souls twisted and broken by the endless bloody struggle for survival. But perhaps this is what sets these mutants apart, their ability to endure the unendurable, to stand against the horrors of the warp with nothing but their own willpower and raw psychic talent to protect them. It's a form of strength that the Imperium can barely comprehend, a kind of resilience that defies the very laws of the universe, and a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the galaxy, life can find a way to endure. And yet, for all their strength, these blind navigators remain deeply, fundamentally alone. Cut off from the Emperor's light, they walk a path that leads them ever deeper into the darkness, their minds forever scarred by the things they have seen and the creatures they have faced. They are survivors, yes, but they are also outcasts, forever separated from the light of humanity by the very power that keeps them alive. It's a tragic, terrifying existence, a life spent on the edge of madness, fighting to hold on to the last shreds of sanity in a galaxy that has long since forgotten what it means to be human. And yet, for all their isolation, for all their suffering, these blind navigators remain a testament to the raw, unbreakable will of the human spirit. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are those who refuse to be broken, who choose to fight on no matter the cost. When it comes to the idea of blind navigators, the Warhammer 40K community has always been filled with wild speculation and half-whispered theories. It's one of those topics that sparks the imagination, a tantalizing glimpse into the hidden corners of the galaxy where the rules of the Imperium break down, and the strange and the impossible become just another part of the story. Some fans even argue that these mutants are a natural evolution of humanity, a glimpse of what the species might become if it ever truly embraced its psychic potential. One of the more popular theories is that these blind navigators might be a throwback to the ancient human psychers of the Dark Age of technology, a time when humanity's mastery over the warp was at its peak, before the horrors of the Age of Strife shattered their civilizations and scattered their knowledge to the stars. In this version of the story, these mutants aren't just an accident of genetic mutation, but a deliberate attempt by humanity's distant ancestors to create a new breed of psychic warriors, beings capable of walking the warp without fear, their minds sharpened by generations of selective breeding and genetic manipulation. Others take a darker view, arguing that these mutants are not a step forward, but a step back, a regression to a more primal form of human psychic potential, the kind of raw, unfiltered power that existed before the Emperor's guiding light brought order to the galaxy. In this version of the story, the blind navigators are seen as a kind of living fossil, a reminder of a time when humanity's place in the universe was far less secure, and the boundaries between flesh and spirit were far more porous. There are even those who believe that these blind navigators might be something more than human, that their powers are not the result of natural evolution or ancient genetic engineering, but the influence of some darker, more malevolent force. They point to the strange, often twisted mutations that seem to accompany these psychers, the way their minds seem to resonate with the darker aspects of the warp, and the eerie, otherworldly abilities that some of them are said to possess. It's a theory that ties into the darker aspects of Warhammer 40K's lore, the idea that the warp itself might be shaping the evolution of humanity, twisting the species into something darker and more dangerous with each passing century. Of course, not all fan theories are quite so grim. Some fans take a more optimistic view, suggesting that these blind navigators might represent a kind of hope for humanity, a new path forward, one that rejects the rigid hierarchical structures of the Imperium in favor of a more flexible, adaptive approach to the galaxy's many challenges. In this version of the story, the blind navigators are seen as the vanguard of a new, more enlightened humanity, their minds free from the chains of the past, their spirits unburdened by the weight of tradition. And then there are the truly wild theories, the kind that only the most dedicated lore enthusiasts would ever dare to voice. Some whisper that these mutants might be the work of some ancient Xenos race, their genes twisted and shaped by the long-dead masters of the galaxy, their minds bound to the will of forgotten gods and alien intelligences that view humanity as nothing more than a particularly interesting experiment. Others claim that these navigators are the descendants of lost human colonies, their psycho abilities the result of generations spent in isolation, their minds shaped by the strange, uncharted regions of the galaxy where the laws of physics break down and the boundaries between reality and madness blur. It's a fascinating, if somewhat terrifying, idea that these blind navigators might not just be a random quirk of evolution, but the product of some ancient, long-forgotten plan, a piece of a puzzle that is yet to fully reveal itself. It's the kind of theory that keeps even the most jaded inquisitors awake at night, their minds racing with the implications of a galaxy filled with hidden powers and forgotten secrets, the echoes of 1,000 lost civilizations whispering through the darkness like the ghosts of a forgotten past. When it comes to the practical question of whether these blind navigators could actually guide ships through the warp, the answer is both complicated and fascinating. On one hand, the idea of using mutants as navigators goes against everything the Imperium stands for. It challenges the strict hierarchical control that the navigator houses have held for millennia and raises the terrifying possibility of entire fleets moving through the galaxy without the guiding light of the Emperor. On the other hand, if these mutants can truly navigate the warp without the Astronomican, they could represent a powerful, if dangerous, alternative to the tightly controlled system that keeps the Imperium's vast empire connected. For a start, these blind navigators would have a unique advantage over their more conventional counterparts, the ability to travel without the Astronomican, moving through the warp without relying on a single, centralized beacon. This could make them incredibly valuable to rogue traders, pirates, and other independent factions who might want to avoid the watchful eyes of the Imperium. It would also make them a powerful tool for the forces of chaos, who could use these mutants to strike deep into the heart of Imperial space, bypassing the conventional trade routes and launching surprise attacks on unprepared worlds. But it's not just about stealth and surprise. If these blind navigators truly can sense the currents and eddies of the warp in a way that more conventional navigators cannot, they might be able to chart entirely new routes through the galaxy paths that are invisible to those who rely on the Astronomican, but perfectly clear to those with the right kind of psychic perception. This could open up vast new regions of space for exploration, regions that have remained inaccessible for centuries due to the shifting tides and unpredictable storms of the immaterium. Of course, there are risks. Without the steady, unchanging beacon of the Astronomican to guide them, these blind navigators would have to rely on their own instincts and psychic abilities to avoid the many dangers of the warp. They would need to be constantly alert, their minds tuned to the slightest hint of danger, their senses sharpened by the constant threat of attack from the entities that dwell in the immaterium. It's a dangerous, exhausting way to travel, one that would push even the strongest psyker to their limits and beyond. But for those who can survive the experience, the rewards could be immense. A fleet guided by these mutants could move with a speed and unpredictability that would make it almost impossible to track, striking without warning and vanishing back into the darkness before their enemies even realized they were under attack. It's the kind of tactic that could turn the tide of a war, allowing a small, mobile force to strike at the heart of a much larger enemy and then disappear before the counterattack could arrive. And then there's the possibility that these blind navigators might not just be guiding individual ships, but entire fleets. If their powers are as flexible and adaptable as some fans suggest, they might be able to coordinate the movements of multiple vessels at once, creating a kind of psychic network that allows entire armadas to move through the warp with a precision and speed that conventional navigators could only dream of. It's a terrifying thought, one that raises the possibility of entire fleets moving through the galaxy without the guidance of the Emperor's light, their paths determined not by the rigid, structured thinking of the navigator houses, but by the chaotic, ever-changing instincts of the blind navigators themselves. Of course, this is all just speculation, the kind of wild, half-crazy theories that spread through the dark corners of the galaxy like wildfire. But if even a fraction of these stories are true, the implications are staggering. It would mean that the Imperium's grip on the galaxy is far more fragile than most people realize, that the carefully maintained order of the Imperial fleets is nothing more than a thin veneer over a sea of chaos, and that the blind navigators represent a crack in the foundation of that order, a reminder that for all its power, the Imperium is not as unbreakable as it seems. When you start thinking about how other factions might use these blind navigators, the possibilities become both intriguing and deeply unsettling. The galaxy is a vast, hostile place, filled with countless species and empires, each with their own goals and ambitions, and it's not hard to imagine that some of them might find a use for these mutants. After all, in a universe where the warp is both a lifeline and a death trap, Having a guide who can navigate its madness without the Astronomican would be an incredible advantage. Let's start with the more obvious candidates, the Chaos Warbands. These blind navigators would be a perfect fit for the forces of chaos, their minds already twisted and scarred by exposure to the warp, their senses tuned to the subtle whispers of the immaterium. For a Chaos Lord looking to strike deep into Imperial territory, these mutants would be an invaluable asset, allowing them to move their fleets without the risk of being tracked by the Imperium's conventional navigator houses. They could slip through the cracks in the Imperial defenses, striking without warning and vanishing back into the darkness before the counterattack could even begin. But it's not just the forces of chaos that might find these mutants useful. The Drukhari, for example, are always on the lookout for new ways to expand their influence and strike at their enemies without fear of retaliation. A blind navigator would give them the ability to move their raiding fleets through the webway with even greater speed and unpredictability, bypassing the heavily fortified Imperial trade routes and striking at the heart of their enemies with the kind of surgical precision that the Drukhari are known for. And then there are the rogue traders, those independent human captains who operate on the fringes of the Imperium, pushing the boundaries of known space in search of profit and adventure. For these freebooters, a blind navigator could be the key to unlocking entire regions of the galaxy that have remained cut off from human exploration for millennia, their paths hidden by the shifting tides of the warp and the ever-present threat of psychic storms. It's a tempting prospect, the idea of charting a course through the unknown, guided by a mutant whose mind is uniquely attuned to the rhythms of the immaterium. But perhaps the most interesting possibility is that some Xenos factions might also be using these blind navigators for their own purposes. The Dark Eldar, with their twisted love of pain and suffering, might see these mutants as a kind of living experiment, a way to push the boundaries of psychic potential without risking their own souls to the corrupting influence of the warp. They might capture these navigators, twisting their minds with dark technologies and forbidden drugs, turning them into living compasses that can guide their ships through the darkest corners of the galaxy. And then there's the possibility that the Necrons, with their cold, machine-like minds and ancient knowledge of the galaxy's hidden paths, might also find a use for these mutants. Perhaps they see them as a useful tool, a way to bypass the conventional methods of warp travel and move their fleets with the kind of precision and speed that their ancient enemies can only dream of. It's a chilling thought, the idea that these blind navigators might be little more than tools in the hands of an ancient, soulless race, their minds reduced to nothing more than a series of complex equations and mathematical formulas, their bodies twisted and broken by the relentless demands of their Necron masters. And finally, there's the possibility that some of these blind navigators might have found their way into the hands of the orcs. It's a strange, almost comical idea, the thought of a hulking orc warlord relying on the guidance of a mutant psyker to lead his fleet through the warp. But if there's one thing the orcs understand, it's the value of unpredictability, and a blind navigator would give them just that, a way to strike at their enemies from unexpected angles, to bypass the heavily fortified Imperial trade routes and hit their foes where they least expect it. It's a fascinating, if somewhat terrifying, thought, the idea that these blind navigators might be more than just a myth, that they might be out there right now, guiding the fleets of humanity's enemies through the darkness, their minds twisted and broken by the endless bloody struggle for survival in the 41st millennium. And if that's true, if these mutants really are out there, then it raises an even darker question. Just how many of them are there? And what might they be planning for the future? When you start comparing these blind navigators to the more conventional methods of warp travel, the differences become pretty stark. The most obvious contrast is with the navigator houses of the Imperium, those ancient bloodlines whose members have been selectively bred for thousands of years to sense the psychic tides of the immaterium. These navigators are born with a third eye, a literal physical mutation that allows them to peer into the warp and chart a course through its ever-shifting madness. It's a dangerous, deeply taxing process, but one that has become the backbone of human expansion across the galaxy. Without the Navigators, the Imperium would crumble, its fleets cut off from the worlds they were meant to protect, its armies stranded light years from their intended battlefields. But the blind Navigators, if they exist, represent a fundamentally different approach to warp travel. They don't rely on the Astronomican, that blazing psychic beacon that guides the Imperium's ships through the darkness, nor do they benefit from the centuries of careful breeding and training that have shaped the Navigator houses into the powerful, if somewhat inbred, institutions they are today. Instead, these mutants seem to rely on something far more primal, a kind of psychic instinct that allows them to sense the currents and eddies of the warp in a way that more conventional navigators simply cannot. This makes them both more dangerous and potentially more powerful than their Imperial counterparts. For one thing, it frees them from the rigid, hierarchical control of the Navigator houses, allowing them to move through the galaxy without the constant oversight and scrutiny that comes with being part of the Imperium's tightly controlled warp travel infrastructure. It also means that they can operate in areas where the Astronomican's light does not reach, places where even the most experienced navigators would be lost, their minds overwhelmed by the chaotic energies of the warp. Of course, this kind of freedom comes at a cost. Without the steady, unchanging beacon of the Astronomican to guide them, these blind navigators are forced to rely on their own senses, their own instincts, to survive in the depths of the warp. It's a dangerous, exhausting way to travel, one that leaves them constantly exposed to the psychic predators that stalk the Immaterium, their minds forever teetering on the edge of madness. But when you start looking at the other methods of warp travel used by the various Xenos races, the picture gets even more complicated. The Eldar, for example, use the Webway, a vast, ancient network of hidden pathways that allows them to bypass the dangers of the warp entirely. It's a system that's as old as their civilization itself, a relic of a time when the Eldar ruled the galaxy, and the warp was little more than a curiosity, a place to be studied and shaped rather than feared. The Webway is incredibly fast, incredibly dangerous, and completely beyond the reach of human science, its pathways twisted and broken by the cataclysmic events that shattered the Eldar Empire and gave birth to Slaanesh. The Orcs, on the other hand, rely on sheer, unrelenting force of will to navigate the warp, their minds protected by the collective psychic field they generate through their sheer, overwhelming belief in their own superiority. It's a brutal, chaotic way to travel, one that often results in entire fleets being lost to the tides of the Immaterium, their crews driven mad or torn apart by the hungry spirits that haunt the warp. But for the Orcs, it works, most of the time at least. And that's all that matters. And then there are the Tyranids, those monstrous, all-consuming swarms of flesh and chitin that pour through the galaxy like a tidal wave of living death. They have their own methods of warp travel, using the immense psychic power of their hive minds to guide their fleets through the darkness, their minds linked together in a vast, instinctual network that allows them to move with terrifying speed and precision. It's a system that's as alien as it is terrifying, a reminder that the galaxy is filled with creatures that see the warp not as a place of danger and madness, but as a vital part of their survival strategy. In the end, the blind navigators represent something entirely different, a middle ground between the highly structured, tightly controlled methods of the Imperium and the wild, unpredictable instincts of the galaxy's countless Xeno species. They are a reminder that humanity's understanding of the warp is still far from complete, that the universe is far stranger and more dangerous than even the most jaded Inquisitor could ever imagine, and that there are still secrets waiting to be discovered in the darkest corners of the galaxy. All right, after everything we've explored, the idea of blind navigators is one of those concepts that really forces you to rethink everything you thought you knew about the Warhammer 40K universe. It's a reminder that, for all the Imperium's claims to dominance and control, there are still vast, uncharted corners of the galaxy where the rules are different, where the old certainties break down, and where the line between myth and reality becomes dangerously blurred. These mutants, if they exist, challenge the very foundations of imperial power. They reject the rigid, hierarchical order that defines the Imperium, choosing instead to embrace the raw, untamed chaos of the warp, their minds sharpened by the constant threat of destruction, their souls hardened against the whispers of madness and despair. They are survivors, wanderers, and outcasts, forever cut off from the light of the Emperor, yet somehow still managing to carve out a place for themselves in a galaxy that has long since forgotten what it means to be human. But for all their strength, for all their resilience, these blind navigators remain a deeply unsettling mystery, a reminder that the warp is still a place of infinite possibility, a place where the rules of physics and reason break down, and where the strongest minds can still be broken by the sheer, unrelenting pressure of a hostile universe. They are a crack in the facade, a glimpse of a darker, more chaotic world that lies just beneath the surface of the Imperium's carefully maintained order, a reminder that, for all its power, the Imperium is not as unbreakable as it seems. And perhaps that's what makes them so compelling. The idea that even in a galaxy ruled by iron-fisted tyrants and fanatical priests, there are still those who choose to walk their own path, to reject the chains of tradition and embrace the chaos of the unknown. It's a dangerous, often self-destructive way to live, but it's also a reminder of the raw, unbreakable will of the human spirit, a force that even the warp itself cannot fully conquer. So, as we wrap up this dive into the strange, unsettling world of the blind navigators, it's worth remembering that, for all the darkness and despair of the 41st millennium, there are still sparks of defiance, still whispers of forgotten power, still echoes of a time when humanity's reach extended across the stars, unbound by the chains of fear and superstition. It's a small comfort, perhaps, but in a galaxy as dark and unforgiving as this one, even the faintest glimmer of hope can be enough to keep the fire burning. And if you want to keep exploring the deepest, darkest corners of this vast, uncaring universe with me, the forgotten histories, the whispered secrets, the half-remembered legends that echo through the darkness like the ghostly howls of dying stars, then be sure to hit that subscribe button and join me on the next leg of this endless, terrifying journey through the heart of the 41st millennium.